Thank you, Renee, and thank you to Powell's Bookstore in Beaverton, Oregon, for hosting Scott and myself. It's an honor to be here this evening. How many of you here this evening who are 60 years or older do not remember where you were when you heard the news that John F. Kennedy had died? How many of you are between the ages of 20 and 60 who do not remember where you were when you heard about the tragedy of 9/11? Sudden, traumatic, unexpected events leave indelible images in our mind and in our psyches. I was 7 years old on November 22nd, 1963. I was in the second grade in a city called Hayward, California, and the older sister of a girl in my class came to the door, because it was raining outside, we couldn't go out for recess, and said the president had been killed. Of course, I didn't believe her. And later that day, I went home across the street to where my grandmother lived and saw my mother and grandmother watching television, and I knew it was real. That weekend, I read everything I could and watched everything I could on television about this extraordinary event. And that was the weekend that was the catalyst for my fascination, my wife would say obsession, with how the news media shape public opinion. In December of 2010, I turned 55 and started wondering, what do I want people to remember me for? What's my legacy? I realized everyone has two legacies, a personal and a professional one. I've been married to the same woman for 31 years. It's because of her I'm a Christian. We have two incredible daughters and a wonderful son-in-law. So that box, the personal legacy, is checked. I started thinking about, well, what about my professional one? I decided to go back to that weekend in 1963. I like to talk to people, so I made a list of 100 people I wanted to ask about John Kennedy and picked up the phone and started calling. Over the next 2.5 years, I talked to 100 people, not the original 100 from the list, but many of them. The first two I tried to get but couldn't. Those were Fidel Castro and Bill Clinton. I even talked to Che Guevara's widow to try to get to Fidel and still got turned down. The third person on the list was Helen Thomas, who covered the White House for 10 presidents. She wound up writing the foreword. She passed away in July. In fact, she's one of 10 people in my book who have passed away since I've interviewed them. I want to show you a brief slideshow of some of the about 90 people who are in the book and some of their reflections on John Kennedy. Afterward, I'll come back for a few minutes, and then Scott will come up and speak.
And I suppose I matured in that 24 hours of the first couple of days. I think that I, became more realistic as a journalist and saw the larger screen probably, and the consequences of daring action and the evil that can come even to America. So I do think it was a seminal time for me. The television set was, if you will, the centrifuge for the country. Everybody drew from it in some fashion. I think his legacy was in the boldness of his rhetoric and declarations.
I met him as a young high school student. I was visiting my father at the United States Capitol, and he and my father were talking, and a photographer took a picture of me taking a picture of the two of them. He would spend time at the White House from time to time, sitting in the president's rocking chair, talking politics and sipping whiskey. They talked about running against each other and decided that instead of wasting a lot of money, they would travel around together and stop at different towns and cities and debate each other. And it would have been very entertaining and would have set a high standard for future campaigns. They ought to be doing that today.
As time went on, in the months, not the years, the months before he was killed, he had begun to shift direction a bit. And you could see him becoming a different person. He watched the pictures of young people being fire hosed in the streets of Birmingham, and he told onlookers, he said, "This makes me sick." And it must have had that effect on everybody who saw it, or most people who saw it. But, you know, for him to feel that way and say that means he was moved by it, and it shifted him.
I was a huge enthusiast. In fact, I recently found, and then of course you find something like this when you're going through your stuff. My notebook from the period, which contained all my material, had a very carefully hand-lettered Kennedy for President message on it. In the conservative world in which I function, there are a lot of people, it's become almost commonplace to suggest that John Kennedy would be a Republican today. Yeah, because he was pro-tax cuts, he clearly was pro-business, and because of the support for a strong defense, strong foreign policy.
When JFK Jr. was born, the chief of the anesthesia department held him up by the ankles and slapped his buttocks. After doing this for several minutes, the infant became very cyanotic, which is blue in color. And I told him the baby needed to be intubated. He handed the baby to me, and I passed a tube into the trachea of the baby. I then handed the infant back to him to breathe into the baby since he was the chief of anesthesia. However, he was a bit nervous and knocked the tube out. I then grabbed the baby back, reinserted the tube, and for about 6 minutes, breathed air into the lungs of the baby. After I left the delivery room, one of the reporters asked me the sex of the baby, and I replied I could not give out any information, and that he'd have to talk to Pierre Salinger, President Kennedy's press secretary. It was later written in the paper that a young doctor came out of the delivery room and did not know the sex of the baby.
It was really good weather, and he came in and sat in my station. There were 3 of them with him, and he looked up at me and he says, "Do you mind having your picture made with me?" And I told him I was pouring that coffee, and I said, "It's my pleasure." And when I said, "It's my pleasure," he just busted out laughing. I guess it's because we talk kind of South-like. And he did. He just died laughing. And that's when they snapped the picture. Someone came in the restaurant and told us that he had been shot. And I just bawled. I cried and I cried, and I still cry. That was the only president that I really loved.
It was a seminal film for me because of the attention that it got, and because of the respect that Kennedy had garnered from the American public. And after we'd finished it, I got a call from the White House asking me if would I like to come back and meet the president. I said, "You bet." So I went down to Washington. I purposely arrived 2 hours early. I wasn't about to be late, so I was honored. He had an innate ability to make you feel very comfortable. It was surprising because all of a sudden a door opened behind me, and the voice, "Hi, Cliff," just as casual as that. He knew people that I knew, so
Right.
it wasn't like we were complete strangers. But anyway, he said, he said very nice things. He couldn't have been more generous and more helpful.
Jack Kennedy figured out how to use television. And I've always had this theory that the most successful politicians are the ones who mastered the dominant medium of their time. I mean, Kennedy came along, and he had this great wit and verve, and he was so good